My name is Pete Tseronis. I am the CEO of Dots and Bridges. I'm the former Chief Technology Officer at the U.S. Department of Energy. And I'm excited today to have two guests who you see on screen with me, Mr. David DeSanto from GitLab and Mr. Ian Lee from the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. We're going to have a wonderful day, or at least for the next hour, talking about a topic that, in light of the title of this webinar, Open Source Doesn't Have to Be Scary. That is no assumption that people think it is, but in my walkabouts in life and even the people I talk to, it's like, what is that stuff anyway? So we'll delve into some of that. The flow today is going to be a bit introductions, jump into some of the themes that were in the abstract that we hope you will find interesting through the storytelling that David and Ian will present. We're going to spend about 20 minutes doing some dispelling of the myth of open source, brought to us by and summarized in the wonderful world of code.gov. So we're going to riff off some of that and then finish with some parting shots, and we hope you stick around for that. For those of you who registered and couldn't make it, we're recording today and we're going to be sending this back out. Shout out to Helen Ortel as well at GitLab for all of her support, and Ian Magazine as well up in the great city of Pittsburgh. Just a little quick background regarding this topic and the Dots and Bridges Thought Leadership Consortium. When you work in government for 25 years, you're blessed to work across many agencies. And as a federal civil servant, when I left 5 years ago, thereabout, having spent so much time in the academic community, I started to understand the technology, humanity, culture intersection. And that's what the Dots and Bridges Thought Leadership Consortium is about. It's about convening influential and passionate individuals from government, academia, and industry, bringing problem solvers together, innovators, and people who are really thought leader change agents. I believe in it's not about the buy, sell, but in the seeker solver. And good things come to the business looking to drive revenue, to the federal individual, the national laboratory individual, the company folk who are just there to say, look, you know, we have knowledge in this space and we want to share that. Tackling challenges, information sharing, and creating connections. That's the goal today, and that's the essence of this consortium. It's a fireside chat. It's if we're sitting in a room. And that's a little bit about me. So what I'm going to do is in about 30 seconds or less, just let you know before I intro David and Ian. David DeSanto, you know, I promised I wouldn't read his bio, and yes, I'm looking down at some notes, but I could tell you, David is somebody I've gotten to know over the last couple of weeks. Network security professional, 15 years of security research and product strategy. Prior to GitLab, he was pervasive across testing services organizations. The guy's a cybersecurity product strategist. He is a thought leader in this space. Master of Science in Cyber from NYU. Shout out to the great state of New York at the School of Engineering. And he's a frequent speaker. I'm a huge fan. He does have an awesome beard. And that's something just I'm sure you've taken note of. It's a beautiful thing with video. Going to my friend Ian Lee, if I read Ian's bio of titles, you'd be like, oh my gosh, he's got many, but you can read about him on LinkedIn. But Ian Lee, high level, incredibly talented, incredibly passionate, charismatic, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. If you don't know where that is, out in Northern California, great place to visit. He's a martial artist. He's an aspiring rock climber. He's a new dad because Ronan is still under a year. Alternate Organization Information System Security Officer, Computation Directorate, Information System Security Officer, Livermore Computing, Cyber Assessment Coordinator, Livermore Computing, and Computer Engineer at Livermore, not to mention an evangelist on the side. So great body of knowledge between the two of these folks. And with that, I'm going to kick it over here to David to get off mute in a minute and just tell us a little bit about your journey and your passion and why you think this can be a great platform for you to share some wisdom.
Absolutely. So I would say I caught the security bug very early in my career, and that has led me to be very passionate about open source and open source security. I started off in healthcare, and I was very surprised by what HIPAA allowed within the contents or constructs of security. The best example I like to give is, mind you, this is many years ago, but faxes were considered secure because you put a cover sheet on them, and it said, please, recycle or shred if this is not meant for you. So, everybody would clearly read a fax they got with a cover sheet and go, oh yeah, that's right. My name's not Ian. I should probably shred this. Obviously that led me to try to understand how do we make things more secure? And from that has just driven a long career of security. To kind of stress the passion I have today for open source and security together, I'm actually the co-chair of the Security Effectiveness Working Group for NetSec Open. They're a nonprofit focused on creating open security standards for both performance and security effectiveness. I also help them run their community, and that includes everything from the website to their meetings like this and so forth. So very much embedded in me. I believe that we can all do better if we're all contributing and making the world just a better place all the way across.
Amen. Love it. And for our audience, as much as we know that we have a wonderful set of attendees, if you have questions, look, nobody's an expert yet in this. There should be a Q&A button, and we will monitor that if there's some questions to come in. So if there is something that we say, an acronym, for example, if you Q&A us, and I've already prepped our guests that we do tend to speak in those, we will explain them. And one of them will be SSOT, which we'll get to in a minute. Ian Lee, the man with a lot of hair behind the head, if you want to do a profile shot, brother. Okay, there we go. Ian Lee, tell us a little something about your passion, buddy.
Yeah, so I've been at Lawrence Livermore for about 10 years now. I started as an intern back in 2010, transitioned to full-time because I liked working at the lab more than I liked racking up grad student loans. So I came straight from grad school into the laboratory environment. I've moved around a lot in the last 10 years. In my time, I found that some of the easiest ways to contribute or collaborate with people, even on site, was out through open source. And to the extent possible, actually pulling those practices internally. Today, more recently, this has become known as inner source, is a term you might hear to describe sort of open source principles applied inside an organization. But about 4 or 5 years ago, I got involved trying to solve some problems we had bureaucratically inside of the laboratory, trying to help make it easier for our developers to get software out, and then also to build a home for once something got released, where that would actually go and how that would get managed and maintained and actually have a community built around it. So we built software.lnl.gov to be a central landing page. Currently, there's around 600 open source projects that the laboratory has produced over the last, I think our oldest one goes back to 1996, which predates the github.com platform for by about 10 years. And actually the Git version control system by about 8, I think. So long, rich history of open source at the laboratory. And I've just been very happy to be a part of it. I grew up coming through the Boy Scouts. I grew up in New England and then transplanted myself to the West Coast. I came up through the Boy Scouts, and so for me, this idea of always leaving things better than you found them has become very deeply ingrained in me. And so for me, even if it's a tiny contribution, like, hey, there's a typo in someone's README as I'm going through something, like that's a little fix that'll help make that project a little bit better for the next person coming.
Amen. Awesome. Hey, Ian, you stole well, I'm glad you mentioned, I was going to say, that's one of the things and comments you left when I first met you about leaving things better than I found them so that those around me believe that they can make a difference. And I think that'll be a theme that both you and David expressed throughout. David, I want to at some point, build it into this, you as well as Ian. Some of the folks may not know that, hey, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory is a national laboratory. It's not just an energy lab. It's one of 17 in our country. They're treasures. They've been around forever and they're historical. I encourage everybody to go read about LLNL, what it is doing for our country and has for years. And GitLab, a great company, doing incredible work in the commercial sector as well as the public sector. So feel free to just, we're not in here to endorse and sell and all that rot, but it's these companies and these entities, it's what makes it all work. And we move that pendulum to the right. All right, so we're going to pivot about 8 minutes in or so here to some of the themes that we were all discussing that we think would be relevant for this topic. And we're not going to get into what's open source and is it free and why isn't it? And oh my gosh, there's all this. We're going to dispel myth a little bit later. But for now, I'm going to pose this question to David, who sits on all sides of code and development and mission enabling innovation. The case for an open source strategy, do you find that that is a hurdle, a challenge, or something that you're seeing more of today?
Yeah, so I would say it's a little bit of both of those. So for me in my career, or now in charge of product for the security components at GitLab, we see on both the private and public sector some concerns of adopting an open source strategy. I like the way Ian explained the intercore or intersource. I can tell you that over the last year of my career, when I've come here to GitLab, very much focused on an open core principle. I think that if you are open and transparent and you work together, everybody can succeed together. And I think that's kind of where the hesitance comes with open source. I think people kind of look at it and they say, well, I'm taking on additional risk or taking on additional concerns. And those are all easily remediated. I know we'll talk about it when we get to the myths area of the call here, but I definitely see it on both sides, but I am starting to see both the public sector and the private sector beginning to adopt the same principles that Ian talked about with intersource, as well as that open core and everybody can contribute approach.
Amen to that. And if Ian, as you have a comment, I'm sure, too, on that, I want to come at it too from a public sector government standpoint. I'm based here in the Washington, D.C. area. And policy-wise, the government has issued open source guidelines and policies and so forth, and they're guidance documents. They're opportunities to leverage it. This is by no means a one or other discussion. I think you'll find that in our topic today. It's complementing. The government is a $90 billion a year purchaser of IT support and services. So there's a lot of open source, there's a lot of proprietary, and it's sometimes just trying to figure out how it can complement, and that's where I think community comes together. Ian Lee, some comments on that with an open source strategy.
Yeah, and not only that, so the government procures a lot of IT, but then, and this is particularly relevant in the laboratories and DOE, there's also a lot of software developed. So the laboratories in particular, we write a huge portion of our code that goes towards our mission areas, supporting stockpiled stewardship and the national mission. And so a lot of that software is never going to be, at its core, a lot of that actually is stuff that may never see the light of day, right? Mm-hmm. It's stuff that has a national security focus and has a national security bent to it. But what the transition's been over the last 20 or 30 years has been, because we have codes that go back 50-year-old codes that are still getting actively developed. What we've seen is a trend towards, while the end application may not be able to be open sourced, the components that go into it may be. And so that can be both things that we pull in from other communities, other organizations that have done great work that we don't need to or want to reinvent the wheel for. There's open source projects we pull in that dozens and hundreds of companies have contributed thousands or probably millions of labor hours into actually working on this project. There's no need for us to reinvent that. It's a complete waste of taxpayer dollars. And you see this today quite a bit with the Exascale Computing Project, which is a DOE initiative to land the first exascale computer in a DOE laboratory. And so that work has actually had a very central focus on open source, where DOE, it makes no sense for DOE to pay every laboratory to develop the same piece of messaging software or networking component, or even the physics libraries necessarily, but instead having each laboratory develop a chunk of that and putting it together is the most efficient in a number of different dimensions.
Great point. And I'm thinking of a segue here, to that component of this community, right? I'm going to go back to Dave, and again, we'll kind of do it this can say, but in DC and government, public sector, DevSecOps or DevOps, coming together, agile methods, there's a lot of product companies that promote that, just like cloud and automation. There's all these buzzwords. But the contribution, and everybody has an opportunity, I think it still is these camps of, well, I'm a coder, I'm a developer, I'm an operator, I'm a strategic thinker. The question I have, or just comment from you both, can you speak to how everyone can contribute, and maybe what is possible in this, call it not new normal, but DevSecOps worlds that we're living in? How does GitLab look at that from an opportunity to bring the workforce together? David? Yep.
That's a very good point. So when you're looking at things like DevOps or DevSecOps, you're really talking about everybody in the company coming together and working together side by side to make something better. And that, to your point, is including the developers who think, I'm here to write the code, whether that's new features, fix bugs, extend something. The security team is like, I'm trying to make everything secure. And the operations people are like, man, I just need to keep this online. I need to have my 5 nines of uptime. And now with a unified approach to that, like a DevSecOps methodology, you begin to see things like security shift left and having the developers be part of that story, which, by the way, reduces scare and risk for them, right? Because they are sitting there thinking like, I'm writing this code, what does it mean? It takes some of the load off the security teams. The security teams find themselves rushing at the end of a release or right before code gets pushed to a production environment to try to test it quickly and make sure it is secure. And then finally, like the operators, they're sitting there thinking like, again, I got to have my uptime. I need to be able to know my environment's stable, because they're responsible for making sure, whether it's a company's customers or existing customers, groups within the public sector, one service using another service's environment, they're really worried about making sure all those components are solid. And that methodology brings that across the entire thing. You now have conversations with developers, with the operations folks about, well, if I did this or that different, does that help you? The security team saying like, hey, by the way, you can actually run your security tests as part of your daily build. And now we're going to find the security issues much earlier and save everybody time and money. And I think now you said like, how does GitLab look at that? GitLab's goal is to make sure everybody can contribute. And that's why we built that single platform we have today, where everybody's signing into the same interface, whether you're in marketing, you're in product, you're in engineering, QA, operations, and then you can collaborate much closer and tighter together. And I see that outside of GitLab in organizations as well. Early on, you mentioned that I've done both public and private sector work, and our public sector customers are really grabbing a hold of that. They like the idea that, hey, you can make, as you said earlier, open source not scary. We need to address this problem for this reason, and instead of having to write it yourself, you can grab something from the community, grab something from another company, as Ian mentioned earlier, and address your goals faster while reducing the risk by using open source security standards, testing early and often, and applying DevSecOps methodology.
So Ian, I'm going to actually pivot off of something he mentioned, being in the ecosystem of, yes, the national labs. You could argue there's a Department of Energy tie, but there's Department of every federal government agency tied to the labs, as I like to say, and also to private industry. But as an evaluator of tools, as someone who is probably and frequently called on to say, hey, what do you think? We got this great stuff and this, that, and the other. Can you impart as a recipient, and I don't mean a buyer per se, but an influencer, which you are, what is the messaging you like to hear if a guy like Dave is coming in to talk, or yes, even somebody in that world of business development or marketing, that, mission matters. It's not about the tools. What is it you like to evaluate when a product company, is knocking on your door, giving you a phone call? What's the message you want to hear from them? You're on mute, buddy.
I think generally the biggest thing that I want to hear is kind of like you were saying, how does it help the mission? Like what is this, how is this going to solve the problems that I'm currently having? Any new tool, no matter what it is going to have some cost to converting from whatever I was doing to whatever I, could be doing. And I think a lot of that then comes to, is the benefit I'm going to get from that tool that I'm going to end up on better than where I'm at now? And that changes a lot, and different people will react to that differently. I think kind of piggybacking off something David said as well, what does this do to bring the people together? So David mentioned, operations and security and your developers and your marketing, and having all those people together in the same platform, I think is really important. I don't know if I want to call it the more traditional or the historical mindset, which I think we're starting to slide away from and continuing to see a shift away from with DevOps, is to have all those people involved in the process much earlier on, when you can make changes and make refinements when they're a lot cheaper, right? If you imagine some big application and you just sort of bin it to the two ends of it. If you have something on a whiteboard where you're just spitballing in a room with a couple of other people, then it's really easy to say, no, we don't need to talk to that. We need to talk to this other backend endpoint, or what if we change to this other thing? It's a dry erase marker and an eraser. Versus when that thing's about ready to go ship, and go live, you've built the infrastructure, you've coded everything in, it becomes really difficult to change anything. And so by bringing the people in earlier, you can start to make those refinements and find out the piece that you as the, let's say the developer, aren't thinking about from the security perspective.
Yeah, I'm going to comment again that the ecosystem of public sector, and we'll just say commercial sector, the opportunity, look, the government, for those listening, and I think would resonate, we have a lot of contractors and support staff who are amazing. We have a lot of OEMs, product vendors. We have a lot of resellers. We have a lot of distributors. And of course, then there's the folks that, you know, are doing the coding in the background in this case. And it's not easy to get everybody in a room, but from the CIO or even the secretary down to understanding the power of open source as a platform for innovation, I think we're moving into that world where the storytelling component and the translation is, yes, you can hire somebody who's a coder. I tried to code in my life. I couldn't code to save my life. But when I taught myself some basic HTML, I thought I was a coder, and then I couldn't replicate what I did and it spent 5 hours doing just to get something bolded on a website. So that wasn't my calling. I still wish I was a sports broadcaster.
Yeah.
So, oh, go ahead, David.
Oh,
Sorry.
yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, I think where Ian was going and where I was going is that, to your comment, if you're applying DevSecOps properly, or even just traditional DevOps, you actually don't need everybody in the same room to get everybody to contribute. I think that's a common misunderstanding. Whether it's GitLab has 1,300 employees located around the world. We don't have any offices. The open source initiatives I mentioned that at the beginning that I've been part of, those people are all in the same location. But if you're applying DevSecOps properly and even traditional DevOps properly, you get to the comment you made that everybody's contributing, everybody's working together, regardless of where they're located or whether or not they even live in the same city and can see each other for a cup of coffee.
Yeah, I think that's that awesome culture component of, the government, the federal government has its president's management agenda, IT modernization, people get it, data transparency and, availability, make data available to do. And then there's the 21st century workforce. And I think DevOps personally falls into that space. And, shout out to GitLab absolutely for kind of embracing that, especially in a world today we're living in where everything is remote. All right, I promise some crazy, go ahead, Ian, you had a comment?
Well, yeah, I just want to build off something you said. So you were talking about, feeling yourself not being a coder. And I think there's a very important role for even people that aren't part of the pipeline, right? What we've been talking about, especially in DevOps pipelines, is the people that are actively involved in building the product. But another thing, and this is where it gets to, not having to be a scary thing, is no matter how good you are, you will never figure out the development team, whatever that looks like, the development community. You're never going to think of every possible way that your tool is going to get used. Your application, you're never going to think of every type of input that you're going to get sent to this website or this application. And so having real users just use that thing and just report back, hey, I tried to do this. I thought this other thing was going to happen, but this third thing actually is what happened. That's hugely important. Like the ability to have someone with a fresh perspective come and look at your application, product, whatever it is huge. And that's actually something that, at a certain point on a development team, everyone's seen it, and you start to lose sight of the problems, and you start to be like, all right, well, I know that I don't really want to do that. I really want to do this, but maybe your documentation doesn't match that. That's something that just any user can, any user who has no development background whatsoever can be like, hey, I read your how-to guide and I went through your quick start, and step 6, that button isn't there anymore, right? That's huge. And especially for adding polish and rounding the edges on things.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that added, and please, that's sort of the role we're going in. I again, just to riff off that, I think that's important for anyone calling on an agency to have a messaging. We talk about it, right? And I was a CTO at 2 cabinet level agencies, but I still loved getting into the weeds with my folks because I had to get it. I had to have my light bulb moment so that when I spoke with our leadership, I said, this is why open source is important, or this is why the cloud is important. And that insightful, I call them light bulb moments, epiphanies are very relevant. So great point there, Ian. I didn't miss that. And that's the community isn't just the community of developers and techno propeller heads. And those of you out there, I think the world of propeller heads. I wish I was part of the club more so, but I just can't I couldn't hold a candle, or you guys, whatever the phrase is. I can't code to save my life.
We'll get you one of those little propeller hats.
Yeah, you know. All right, so listen, we got about 5 more minutes in this section, but I wanted to get to, and this is maybe a little quick fire to close it out. One of the questions, single source of truth for documentation. That sounds technical, but at the end of the day, can you both maybe take a minute to just say why single source of truth is important? Let's start with you, Ian.
So it has a lot of benefits. I think one of the most obvious is, at least to me it's obvious, is not everyone reinventing the wheel. So, and not everyone coming to a different answer. So one of the stories that I like to tell, I gave a talk at a DOE cyber conference a few years about this, was in 2015, the Office of Management and Budget in DC came out with a new requirement for government agencies, sort of a thou shalt use HTTPS on your websites. That was a very trending thing in the community. People in industry were very actively moving over to that. You've seen a huge uptick from like 40% of websites on the internet using HTTPS to, I think, depending on your country, it's between 80 and 90% today. And so this mandate came out of government agencies, thou shalt do X, Y, and Z, and it actually ended up falling to DHS eventually to do the scanning and the reporting out to agencies. And so, like for instance, at Lawrence Livermore, we got our report from DOE headquarters, who in turn got it from DHS. And so, we found this website and it had, checked these 2 boxes, but not this third one. We had this other website, checked all the boxes. This third website checked all the boxes. But different sites, different organizations, different agencies would have slightly different responses. And like, well, how'd you get that answer? And when I check it using my tools, it looks fine to me. And so what ended up happening was there was a partnership between GSA and DHS to co-develop a tool to be the source of truth. And so this became what DHS is actually using for their scanning. It's a tool called Pushed. You can find out on GitHub. It's on the DHS NCATS organization now. Or no, sorry, CISAGov. It moved to CISAGov.
Yes.
And so that tool is the tool that the government uses as their benchmark. So yes, there was a policy. It was written in words that, you must have HTTPS and you must have a proper certificate. But at the end of the day, different organizations will interpret that, and there's different standards that different places employ. And even some of the main public websites for checking and validating some of these things might give slightly different answers. So this gave an opportunity to be the one thing. This is how you were going to be graded. And what's happened is agencies over time, Lawrence Livermore, I was involved in contributing a fix back myself. We were able to contribute back to the tool that changed the entire standard for that everyone was held to, based on what we found as we were actually using it. That well, we were looking for this, but really there's this corner case that we never thought of that we fixed. And that, applies universally across agencies, and a bunch of agencies have contributed to that effort.
Good exemplar. David DeSanto, comments on single source of truth or anything Ian mentioned?
Yeah, so I think Ian's spot on the value of single source of truth. What I think people don't realize is that if you have an open source project and it's a helpful solution, it's even more helpful with documentation. Going back to our comment earlier about coders and the role they have, and how if you're a non-coder, you don't know what value you can potentially provide. The best value you can provide is documenting it. And the reason why I say that is it allows everybody to be able to benefit from it. By documenting, you end up also finding areas, that sounds like Ian was mentioning as well, where you can continuously improve the tool. And by continuously improving the tool, you continuously improve the documentation. And that's a nice, healthy back and forth to have a point where, and Ian said it very well, is that now you have this single point. It's a tool, it's documentation that everybody can go use and everybody can get the same result, or be able to identify why the results are different than somebody else. And I can't stress that enough. That is a very powerful place to be.
Awesome. Hey, you know what? I'm going to play with this Q&A. We've had 2 questions come in, or at least I've asked our panelists. From Brenda. Brenda, your question, which was in here, was as a non-coder, we're going to start with Dave, and let's just kind of keep our responses to about quick and dirty so we can get into the myths, but I want to get to a couple of these. As a non-coder, how does a requester ensure their needs for security and site-specific requirements are met when meeting with developers? What questions should they ask? David?
That's a great question. And by the way, I don't know if Pete, you're starting with me because you don't think I'm a developer, because I'm not in a market role, but I do still write code. It might be hacky, but I do that. What a non-coder would do, whether you're in marketing, product management, program management, make sure you're defining very clear objectives. That way you're essentially building a mini to-do list that you can iterate over. An example of that being is like, what do you want the outcome to be? You know, using Ian's example from before, I want all sites to be HTTPS. Okay, now what does that mean? And then you can begin to say, well, I expect it to be, you know, TLS 1.2 with PFS because I'm looking for strong encryption. Great. I also expect that to be on HTTP and HTTP2. You know, when you start iterating through that and you identify it, it allows the developer to kind of use it as like a burn down list, or in my career, it's been Kanban boards that I've loved. So you have this list of things that people can just go, okay, that done. Next one, that one done. And allows that non-coder to understand that, one, the thing they're getting meets the need, and two, it allows the developer to be able to collaborate and improve upon what maybe you're looking to do.
Fantastic. Ian, I have a question just because, you know, your titles alone reference a lot of the high performance computing space in government. And again, for our audience, there's a lot of supercomputing in this world, and there's a lot in the United States, and there's always a who's the fastest, but there's a lot of that going on. Can you, in layman's terms or layperson's terms, talk about the significance of open source and HPC? And I'm just pulling off the top of my head. Is there a direct correlation to that with the community component when it comes to supercomputing, high performance computing?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of alluded to this earlier in the discussion, but open source software is really the foundation of high performance computing. I mean, it starts all the way down at the operating system, right? Almost all HPC computing that I'm aware of is done on Linux, which is an open source operating system. That's been out in the open for 25-ish years now. And so that's continually getting developed by the community. And then that gets layered on top, you know, you put your file system on top of that, how you actually store your files on disk. One of the biggest projects that we, at least at Lawrence Livermore, use is a project called ZFS. That project started internally at Lawrence Livermore. It started in my building. The developer sits in my building. And that's actually gone out to be a open source project that's actually right in mainstream Linux distributions. So ZFS on Linux is available out of the box in Ubuntu since I think it was 1604. And so these things start, and then, you know, you add on top of that your physics libraries or your you know, basic simulation orchestration tools are getting a lot of open source efforts, and these are getting collaborations from all across HPC centers all over the world. So all of these different components that are open source come together.
Yeah, no, and that's like the DNA of computing, coding, whatever you want to say. Not that everybody maybe needs to know. I always like to talk about the energy sector when I'm saying, look, you flip a switch on, you want the lights to turn on. But there's a lot going on in there, from generation, transmission, to distribution, to it happening. And that's what gets into a whole other discussion about critical infrastructure. But we, at the end of the day, just want it to work. And I just like to give shout outs. So there's a lot of wisdom, and you two represent that, you know, going into that ecosystem. All right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to pivot to some myth. I'm going to say it, and then you two are going to, you know, we have 8 or so. We may get through them. We got about 20. Let's just respond with you know, what you believe it is fact or fiction, but at least it's a myth that our good friends at code.gov defined. All right, this is going to you, Dave DeSanto, to start. Myth: OSS, open source software, is developed by students and enthusiasts and not real developers. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I would say that's very far from the truth. There are a lot of major companies today that are contributing to open source. A couple of quick examples. GitLab is an open core company. Our product is open sourced. We have lots of contributors, whether they're internal employees, external people who are just part of the GitLab community, contributing software to that platform. Other examples, Kubernetes kind of goes to the conversation a minute ago with Ian. It's like that is a platform that is helping people be cloud native and be able to be agnostic to what cloud provider they're on. And that is driven by open source. And those are developers at places like Google. I think that speaks very well to it. And the last example, even in the former space I was in where I was doing network performance testing, Cisco made their own open source tool that they contributed to the community, and people are constantly improving upon that. And those people are not just students and enthusiasts, they're real developers from around the world contributing together to make something really awesome. And I think that the more we contribute to open source, the more you're going to have more and more large companies allowing their developers as part of their job to contribute back to those types of things.
Ian?
Yeah, I think, David listed several of the companies. Two more that I wanted to point out, though, and this kind of goes a little bit to a question we had from Jeremy, is, so Microsoft and Apple, even as the big, computer manufacturers, they also incorporate massive amounts of open source. Microsoft in particular is an interesting use case in the last few years. And so Jeremy's question was, one of the big challenges to using open source has been getting authorization because of this view from the C-suite of something not being supported. And so even companies like Microsoft, right, traditionally very much about buy our product, no, you can't see the source code, very proprietary. We've seen this pivot over the last several years where they've become very open source forward. If you look on the internet, on GitHub, you can find literally hundreds of repositories from Microsoft, and many of the big application products they're making are open source, to the point where they're actually going back and open sourcing some of their old software. So I believe it was Calculator. You could go and actually find the source code from like one of the early
Texas
Windows 95, Windows 98, like quite an old version of that. So more recently, the Visual Studio Code, which is a really great text editor that I use, that's an open source project that is developed by Microsoft. And so that, to the point about not supported that Jeremy asked, was, that's a tool that's supported by a massive company with an entire dedicated team of resources. So just because it's open source doesn't mean it's unsupported. And certainly those Microsoft people are not just students working on their side.
Yeah, I want to riff off Jeremy's question. Thanks for that question, Jeremy. Looking forward to seeing you, buddy. Cybersecurity, this isn't to go down the rabbit hole of, oh, the sky is falling, but I've never looked at cyber as a cost center, as a CTO, hey, it's part of the ecosystem. How do you respond, or what is the message, succinct message, to when people in that CISO community, the Chief Information Security Officer, for those of you who I'm sure know what we're talking about. If not, that's what it is. It's the person who wants to keep things, safe and secure as best they can. Open source and cyber, it's not like this one, cybersecurity strategists don't have a perspective on it. What do you say when you're having that discussion, David, about cybersecurity when it comes to open source? What's the headline that you can dispel in terms of myth there?
Yeah, there's really two things that come up regularly when I talk to customers at any place I've worked or people just in the community. I'm concerned that the software is not secure and it may have backdoors into it. And there's a couple really easy ways to just dispel those concerns. The first is, and I've seen this a lot in the financial sector, you say, I'm willing to use open source projects that have contributions from only the following countries, or build the opposite of that, like a block list. I will only use ones that include just not these countries. The other thing is you can look at the contributors and see how much contributions are actually occurring. To Ian's comment about HPC, there's a lot of open source going into that and other cloud native type initiatives. And you don't want to necessarily select something that maybe it's 4 years old and hasn't been looked at by anybody. You can set those types of policies to remove the concern. You can also extend what you're doing to make sure it's okay. And you can do things such as stack analysis or SAS scanning of the code, looking for vulnerabilities, checking the dependencies that are being invoked to make sure those aren't vulnerable as well. And there's a lot of ways that you can remove that risk and make it approachable and allow your company to use it to meet your initiatives and then and address the concerns, whether it's compliance or just the general misconception that open source automatically means it's not secure.
Ian, comment?
Yeah, I think the flip side of that is also very relevant. So just because something's produced by a company doesn't necessarily imply that it's getting support. Now, you might be able to build that into a contract potentially, but depending on if you're just picking up something off the shelf, there may not be a contract where you can really get some oversight on that. Whereas if something's open source, you can at least do your own homework and convince yourself whether you're comfortable or not with, this thing hasn't been touched in 4 years. Just because you got something off the shelf doesn't mean that it's actually gotten looked at. There have been many incidents where even just because a product that you're paying for might use some other component from wherever, and maybe they are or maybe they're not actually updating that. If you can look at the code yourself, then you can actually add some checks and rigor on controlling that. So you can make an argument that there's actually potentially less risk because you have more visibility into what that product is, what it's doing. You mentioned.
No, I was just going to say, I love that it's about risk mitigation, and it's not, these discussions can spiral into it's not secure. And yet, both you and David said it's part of the discussion, and here's how we mitigate that in an open source world with proprietary solutions. They have to coexist. They do coexist, right? You were going to say something, Ian? I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's okay. So one of the other examples that's not specifically a development one, but it's one that I like, coming from more of a cybersecurity background, is there's been this, if you look at sort of literature and the history of cryptography algorithms, there were various companies that had their own proprietary solution and sort of the, trust us, this algorithm is secure, talking specifically a lot about the algorithms. That said, trust us, this algorithm's secure, no one's going to break into it, but we're not going to give it to you to investigate. And what happens is they release that thing out in a product, and someone figures out how to break it, and now you're in trouble for quite a while. Whereas what the shift has been is now the majority, really the only algorithms that are currently trusted in a lot of modern applications and a lot of modern uses by the government or whoever are those that many security engineers, many security researchers can see openly, look at, poke at, and make their determination, give that feedback about whether that thing is actually secure or not.
I'm having a light bulb moment living back in the day where if I knew I was meeting with an open source, call it entity, I almost am thinking, I'm going to come in and say, dispel the myths before we get into the value proposition, because you're obviously a great company, versus the 10-point PowerPoint, 10-page PowerPoint of who you are, who your customers are, and why it's so great. It's like, deal with the elephant in the room, which is open source is not less secure than proprietary software, and here's why. And then you can get into the meat of all that good stuff.
And it would give a company a lot of good opportunities to say why they're not any less secure, right? They can point openly to, here's all the things that we're doing, and people can just go look at it. They don't just have to take your word for it.
Good points. David, you're nodding. You want to put another comment in there before I go to the next myth?
No, just agreeing with Ian.
Okay.
That was my visual thing. I could do this too.
Yeah, no, I love it. I'm watching. I love the video, man. It's like almost practically real time. Okay, so let's go to David here. Myth: there is no support for open source software. I know we've answered some of it, but that's a comment that's thrown out there.
Fact. Yeah, no, I don't think that. I think again that's way far from the truth. What I like to do is let Ian to kind of take a dive at this one, since of all the work he's been doing at HPC and whatnot. So I'm just deferring to him if that's okay.
Okay, Ian.
Yeah, I think I touched on this a little bit already, but certainly the idea that it's not supported is I think just flat out false. You can look at a huge number of open source projects that get huge amounts of support, many contributions. We have open source projects that came out of the laboratory that have hundreds of unique contributors, so hundreds of people that have contributed to something, where there are potentially dozens or hundreds of updates happening to that project every single day. And this I think ties back to our discussion earlier about DevOps. The more that you structure your DevOps pipeline, the more you can be responsive to those changes coming in, whether they're your development team or someone from the community coming in and giving something. You reduce your risk, you actually gain more visibility into how someone's changes is affecting you, and you can become more responsive to it. And I think that all leads to then becoming even more responsive to support, right? It becomes easier to support something the less you have to do manually to keep looking at it and say like, okay, this Pete, this guy off the street, I don't know who he is, but he came in and he said, we should change this code to do X. Here's his fix. I don't necessarily want to go digging into all the weeds of that. If I have a nice robust pipeline, then I can get some confidence up front that, well, this isn't going to break all the functionality that I already had, and maybe it'll solve their use case.
Well said. And you know, it's 12:45, and I'm again reserving about the final 10 for some parting shots and thank yous. But I wanted to suck a little air out of the next 30 seconds because we're not going to get to all these myths, and I think they are kind of morphing together. But I would like David and Ian in those 30 seconds, because you dudes, you know, you think on your feet. I want you to come up and say, Pete, here's a myth that people aren't aware of, is out there, and you didn't happen to mention it, so let me respond to it. If you have one, if not, no big deal. For our audience, myth, we answered, there's no support for open source software. Myth, open source software is not scalable, okay? These are myths I'm giving, and I know these guys could speak literally to that they are. Myth, no one gets paid for developing open source software. Myth, open source software is chaotic, undocumented, and unrefined code. And lastly, myth, open source software is not enterprise level software. So, not that I'm the one who's Nostradamus or the sage here. Open source is alive and kicking all through government and commercial world. But you know, those who call on the government, those who call on industry, and those who are being the recipients of information, I would suggest get to myth dispelling in the first 5 or 10 minutes so you can dive into the capabilities that a GitLab has that differentiates from and has its own value proposition from its competitors, competimates, frenemies. And just know that, look, the government is a buyer of tech. And I would argue you want to talk about what makes your little slice of specialness to that mission, enabling mission, unique. So that's kind of my parting shot in preview. But all right, so David, did you come up with a myth that I didn't throw out there?
Yeah, I actually wanted to combine two of them with a myth that we haven't really talked about. And it's kind of the story of no one gets paid to write open source, it's not enterprise level, and it's hard to contribute. Because I think that's kind of the last part of tying that all together. And obviously, we pay our employees at GitLab. Maybe that's a shock to people, but they get paid and they're writing open source software. Same thing with all the other companies we've been talking about on this call, whether it's Microsoft, Apple, Cisco, whoever. It's also enterprise level software, you know, whether it's coming from an organization like a GitLab who's writing a platform and sharing it, or it's coming from the community where it's purely just open source driven. It's just a big fallacy to think that open source automatically means it's not enterprise grade. And to kind of tie those two together is the barrier of entry to contribute. I've heard throughout my career people say, kind of like how we started, Pete, you know, it's like, oh, I'm not a developer, so how would I even contribute? And I'll use an example from my own life. So I'm contributing to the GitLab platform, and I'm not a developer there, right? I am taking the time when I see something incorrect to update our documentation, clarify a mistake that I see in our source code. And I'll admit that I've not fixed our source code. It's always been on our documentation, but we literally just had a contributor within the last week using our Defend platform and realized, hey, there's something wrong on the screen, and they made a quick Vue.js update and committed it. You know, that person could be a full-time developer. They could literally be somebody who's at home who's just trying to learn JavaScript, but they can contribute to that, and it still stays enterprise grade. The people do get paid to work on it in the case of a lot of the things of the examples, and the barrier of entry is not as high as it needs to be. You know, it's very low. Like a single line of code that you see something that you can fix, that's contributing to open source, and that's a big help for everybody who's using the application.
Awesome, awesome. Ian.
Yeah, to build off of David's ending there, I think one of the other things is a lot of the platforms, whether it's GitLab, GitHub, various other platforms, have also made efforts to make it easier to make those contributions. And so the barrier for someone to develop code or make one of these contributions can be as simple as just going to a website, clicking on the edit button, changing the word that has the typo in it they found as they were reading it, and hitting submit to make a pull request or a merge request, and get that into the project. One of the myths that I think we kind of talked about a little bit is so we've been talking about open source myths, but I think the flip side of that is also important to think about. And what things do you believe about closed source, proprietary projects that may or may not actually be true? Like,
Right.
Okay, you can question whether open source is secure or not, or supported or not, but what do you actually know about the proprietary project, application, product, whatever that you're looking at, and whether it's actually supported or secure or getting updates? Like you don't necessarily know anything more about that project than you do about an open source project. And I would argue in a lot of cases, because of the transparency, because of the openness, open source projects, you can look at them. You can go on their project page and say, look, they've got all these updates. These are the things they fixed. They've got a community of 10 people working on it. It's not just one person. Just because it's a bigger company with a bigger name that's making something doesn't automatically make it better.
Great points. I actually want to pivot. There was a question that came in from a colleague out at the National Energy Technology Lab, Vic Baker. Awesome guy. Vic, thanks for the question. I think it's a good question to put out there because, when you get into the world of tech transfer and commercialization and so forth. Thoughts on intellectual property and open source, the dilemma of to contribute or not to contribute. Do you two have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I want to hit on one thing that Ian said, then I'll answer that. But
Oh, okay. Go for it.
Ian hit on something that I think is the core story to this problem. It's like closed source may mean that you're taking the ostrich approach to security. You're sticking your head in the sand and being like, well, I don't have to worry about it because it's not open. But he's spot on in that you can see that you can get a better sense of your risk with something that's open source. And that ties back into the two things. So the first part of answering the question is like, if you're considering using open source, you have a much broader view of what actually needs to happen for you to be secure. And you can see that today. I'll thank Ian for giving the plug to GitLab. We're open source first. You can have a level of confidence that it's safe to use because you can see all of it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the things that gets missed. And by the way, we support open source community projects as well, where people can come and host their software for free. To the question about is it proprietary, is it not, and what intellectual property am I giving up by doing it? I think there is maybe a myth we kind of skip to a degree because of the complexities of it. But just because something's open source does not mean it can't be intellectual property and can't be trademarked. Like if you go to websites like chooselicense.com, which I'll say I don't have any clue who that is. I just not inadvertently plugging them. It's just a site I use. It's going to compare the open source licenses for you, and you can decide like, hey, I want to be permissive. I'll use MIT so that way I can get community contributions from everyone, and they can be pulled back into commercial projects. You can choose to go something that's more restrictive, that gives you maybe better chance of trademarking or saving as intellectual property of your company. But I wouldn't confuse intellectual property with closed source versus intellectual property and open source. Both allow you to have that intellectual property, the trademark value and whatnot. And GitLab's a great example of that because all of our code is licensed to MIT and it's still there and it's usable, and we can trademark the components we want to trademark and so forth. I'm sure Ian has a little bit to add to that too.
Yeah, well, go ahead.
Just gonna say that, so chooselicense.com, I know the person who originally wrote that. They read a lot of great articles. Guy by the name of Ben.
So you can tell me got a plug on the person got a plug on this since I mentioned it.
Yes. He does some great work. He also writes articles. He came from a government background before he moved into the private sector. But I think, like you said, there's the copyright options that you have when you author something. It's still something that you're authoring, and obviously this varies across country boundaries, and I am not a lawyer at all, so I don't know all the intricate details, but you still have the rights to the thing that you author. Now a lot of times that's the company you work for is really the one who owns those rights, but you have rights to the code that you're writing, even if you put it out there as open source. And the default when you put something else out there is that it is copywritten, and no one else is really allowed to use it until you put a license on it. That's why licenses are so important, and those conversations are so important to have with your local legal folks. Where you started at, though, I think is also good, and I wanted to plug one of Robbie's comments that he left here in the chat
Robbie
to us
Gold.
was, is that just because something's proprietary doesn't mean that it's more secure. It just means that you have someone to yell at if there's issues.
Good point. Good point. Little comic relief. Hey, I want to be fair as we move into the parting shot. So guys, again, this is me giving that little transition time to think about what you want to leave with this audience today. Again, the goal is to inform, to educate, and enlighten. So think about that, because we're going to send this video out to everybody who wasn't able to attend, and they'll get to see it not live. But David, product for the secure and defend stages. As much as I was impressed with Ian's many titles around, can you just give a little soundbite on what that title means to you personally and what it actually is?
Sure. So for GitLab, we talk about the DevOps lifecycle, and we broke it into multiple stages. And the different stages mean where you are in your life cycle, whether that's create, which is focused on your source code creation, verify, where like our CI/CD functionality lives. I'm responsible for the security parts of that lifecycle. So secure is application security testing focused offering. And that means we offer everything from stack analysis, dynamic analysis, software composition analysis. We're even getting ready to launch fuzz testing as well this year, but giving you the ability to test your source code before you ship it and test it on a hard shift left right next to the developer so you can find issues sooner. On the defense side, that's really the operational security. We're focused on cloud native first, so we offer several different services that are Kubernetes focused for security, including web application firewall, container network security, and we're in the process of launching our container behavioral analytics, which brings in container integrity, malware, exploit scanning, and so forth to give you a sense of your security and protecting yourself as you push code into operations.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you. I just didn't want to gloss over that. That's.
Oh no, it was good to clarify, because a lot of people don't know what those two terms mean unless you go look at our website. But it's definitely, we're leading with the security first approach, and that's why I came to GitLab. You know, my passion for open source and passion for security, they combine perfectly at GitLab.
Good, good, good. Ian, the parting shot.
I think the big thing that I want to leave people with is what we started with, which is that open source really doesn't have to be scary. That actually making a contribution can take you as little as 5 minutes. So the same person that wrote the Choose a License website we were talking about, he also has a great blog post that he keeps up about topics in open source and government and how these things interplay. That itself, that blog is an open source project. And so at the bottom of every single one of his pages, every single one of his blog posts, there's a button that says edit. And you can click on that. It'll take you right to where you can just type the fix into your code. So some of the early contributions I was doing just on my own free time was I was reading his blog posts, found them really interesting, and just noticed a few typos, right? Everyone's human. They make copy edits, and whether it's a broken link or something that moved or a typo or the wrong use of there, it was very straightforward and took less than 5 minutes for me to contribute a fix back to him. It got to the point actually where I wasn't reading his blog posts on his website. I was actually reading them in the edit view for contributing back, and I would live type as I was reading his blog post any fixes I found at the end, just hit contribute back, and then he could look at them and go, yep, I agree with them, merge. It probably took less than 5 minutes on both our parts to get something live on his website that was reflecting a slightly better wording.
And for our audience, Ian has done, which I deeply appreciate, edits to even some stuff I've shared with him, knowing that he's also an awesome tech writer and editor as well. So thank you, Ian, for that. David DeSanto, parting shot.
Yeah, I mean, to build off of the open source doesn't need to be scary. There are so many different ways to approach this where open source is very much approachable. That gets into a couple of comments I made earlier. you can, if you're worried in the public sector about code coming from certain parts of the world, you can always just set requirements that things you're using don't include contributors from there. You can also set an account for the amount of contributors. I agree with Ian, it's kind of like something could be 4 years old and not updated, and that does make it vulnerable. But if it helps you get more comfortable, you could do that. You could say contributions within the last year and has X amount of contributors on the project. So it's not just going to be abandoned and you'll be left to support it yourself. You can also integrate security testing into that process. I talked a little bit earlier about you could run stack analysis or software composition analysis to make sure that software you're now bringing in is actually secure and is very useful for you. And I can't stress enough the final point here on this, and it builds off what Ian said. Open source gets better if everyone contributes, and that doesn't have to be software. It can be documentation like we talked about earlier. Maybe it is. Maybe you're a brand new developer or you want to be a new developer and you know a little bit about a certain language. You can always contribute a little fix you might see. It might even be a little bit of an improvement. I can tell you that a lot of the open source projects I've committed to over the years, they do a very good job of having a list of open issues that they need to fix in it. So you can see that whether it's GitHub issues, as Ian mentioned earlier, GitLab issues you can see on there. And you just go in there and be like, hey, I'm going to fix this one thing. It might be like the fix we just got from the community on our Vue.js module was not loading one of the components properly. It's like, it doesn't have to be a big boundary to join. And of course, I can't stress the documentation part enough. I think documentation is key to helping more people adopt what you're working on.
Yeah, it also gives you that opportunity to get some focus on the thing that you most care about, right? Rather than trying to convince the company, the whoever originally authored the code, that they need to care about the thing that you care about. You can contribute that thing back on your own.
Okay, well, listen, folks, hopefully this was a taste. I can't thank David and Ian enough. I mean, again, the technology and how it impacts humanity and how that impacts culture, and now that is impacted by technology. This is not a technology problem. Here at the consortium, we believe in, that component of inform and educate and enlighten. We hope you were today. These are two incredible individuals. Yes, they work for great companies and great labs, but you can search them out on social media and find all cool stuff about them. Ian Lee, I mean, all those books in the background has a story. Obviously, Mario and Luigi behind our friend and the man with the beard, the coolest beard that I've seen, in the past months. David DeSanto, thank you. And we look forward to continuing the dialogue. This is something that's important both to public and private sectors, the symbiotic relation. We are not about just buying and selling. We're about seekers and solvers, and bringing that community together is hopefully something you took away from today. So thank you guys and everybody who tuned in, and we'll be seeing you again.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Pete.